The Farwell Resources annual gala filled the main ballroom of the Palliser Hotel in Calgary with 600 guests on the second Friday of November, and Felix Draper was stationed 40 feet from the east corridor door with a radio he hadn't needed to use since March. What no one at the gala knew about Felix, and no one at the loading dock either, was that he had spent 11 years as a paramedic with Alberta Health Services, and 3 of those 11 in a specialized neurotoxicology response unit covering the industrial corridor from Edmonton to Fort McMurray. 11 specialists had looked at Constance Farwell's son for 3 years and agreed on what was wrong with him. Felix looked at him for 40 seconds and knew they were wrong, and the knowing came from a place none of those 11 could have reached. He had left paramedicine in 2019. The hotel application listed his employment dates and nothing else, because the hotel had not asked for anything else. His daughter, Rosie, was 22 now, finishing a graphic design certificate at night and living in a shared apartment on 118th Avenue in Edmonton. She had been 14 when the tremors started. At the time, they were living in a second-floor unit on McPherson Road in Sudbury, Ontario, where Felix was posted with a provincial ambulance service, and Rosie was starting high school and her mother had been gone for 3 years. The tremors came on slowly, right hand first, then the left, and a pediatric neurologist saw her twice and said the word functional and meant it as a diagnosis. A child psychiatrist added conversion disorder. A third specialist suggested medication for early onset anxiety. Felix had filled 1 prescription and watched his daughter for 2 months and understood that the shaking was worse when her hand was at rest and better when she was reaching for something, which was the opposite of what conversion disorder produced. He did not raise this with the psychiatrist a 3rd time because the 2nd time, a note had appeared in the file describing the father as resistant to psychiatric framing. He took Rosie to a toxicologist at Sunnybrook named Dr. Arnav Kohli, who was 34 and had not yet built the kind of credential wall that stops people from listening. Kohli ordered a hair mineral analysis and a 24-hour urine collection. The manganese level came back 4 times above the reference range. The source was a corroded solder joint in the building's main water riser, failing quietly for 6 years. The building had 12 units. 4 other families were affected. The owners had received a maintenance report about it in 2016 and filed it in a drawer. Rosie spent 18 months in chelation and recovery. She drew again by the end of the 2nd year. Felix left paramedicine 12 months after the diagnosis because he had spent enough time in a system that rewarded certainty over accuracy, and he was no longer willing to watch colleagues defer to the longest credential in the room when the longest credential was wrong. The hotel job paid $2 more per hour on overnight shifts. That was the calculation, in full. He did not think of Sudbury often. He thought about it at 8:15 that Friday evening, the moment he saw Julian Farwell cross the hotel lobby toward the washrooms. He had not been watching Julian specifically. He had been watching the lobby the way he watched everything, without looking for anything in particular, which was the only way to actually see. What he saw was a young man whose right hand, hanging at his side, was doing something his left hand was not. Not a visible shake, a slight rhythmic self-contained tremor that came and went and came back, and that disappeared completely the moment Julian reached out to push the washroom door. Felix waited. Julian came back through the lobby 4 minutes later, and Felix walked a parallel course 30 feet away and watched the gate. The left foot cleared the floor marginally more than the right. The right arm swing was reduced, not the bilaterally proportional stiffness that antipsychotic medication produced. Asymmetric. Asymmetric meant peripheral, not central. Asymmetric meant something localized was interfering with the basal ganglia on one side, and basal ganglia interference in a 22-year-old with 3 years of psychiatric history, and no improvement on 3 different medication trials did not present this way unless the psychiatry was wrong. Julian stopped near the ballroom entrance. Felix stopped too, a few feet behind, and watched him track a server crossing the floor. The eye movement was smooth until it wasn't, a half-second lag on the left side before the tracking resumed. Psychotic interruption. Not psychosis. Neurological. The last time Felix had seen that specific combination of findings was in a hospital bed in Sudbury. He stood with his radio in his hand and thought about what he was about to do, and then he did it. Julian was stepping into the alcove near the coat check when Felix followed and said his name. Julian turned with the expression of someone deciding whether to engage. Felix held up his hand so the radio was visible. "Staff, not guest. Do your hands shake when they're resting?" he said. "Not when you're doing something, when they're still." Something shifted behind Julian's face. "Careful. Who are you?" "Security. I'm not here in any official capacity." Felix kept his voice level. "I was a paramedic for 11 years. Neurotox cases in the industrial corridor. I had a daughter who had what I think you have, and it took 14 months to find it because everyone was looking in the wrong direction." He paused. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking whether anyone has ever ordered a full environmental tox panel, whole blood manganese and arsenic and lead, not the standard blood work, the full screen." Julian looked at the wall. "I don't think so." "Has anyone asked about where you've spent time? Summer properties near industrial operations?" The coat check attendant glanced over. Julian shifted. "My family has a property on the Peace River, near Dunvegan. I spent summers there as a kid. Still go when I can." Felix knew that stretch of river. He knew what sat upstream of it. Before he could say anything else, Lena Strick appeared at the alcove entrance with Julian's jacket folded over her arm and an expression that took in the situation in under 2 seconds. She looked at Felix's badge. She said gently, "Julian, your mother's looking for you," which Felix was fairly certain was not true, and she put her hand under Julian's elbow and walked him back toward the ballroom without addressing Felix at all. Julian looked over his shoulder once. Felix stood in the alcove and thought about a family property near Dunvegan and a tailings retention facility that Farwell Resources had been operating 6 kilometers upstream for 9 years, and the annual environmental compliance filings that described the liner system as intact and what the word intact cost to print every year on a document nobody outside the compliance subcommittee ever read in full. He found Constance Farwell at 9:10, near the silent auction tables between a donor conversation and a scheduled photograph. Getting there cost him a redirected approach past a foundation coordinator and a hard look from her security detail. And when he said her name, she turned with the practiced patience of a woman who had been stopped 40 times that evening. "Your son's right side resting tremor is asymmetric and his saccadic tracking interrupts on the left," Felix said. "That's not how psychiatric medication side effects present. That's basal ganglia interference. And if he's been near your Peace River property in the last 4 years, I think you need to talk to a toxicologist tonight." The patience did not survive the sentence. What replaced it was the flat, careful assessment of a woman who had spent 3 years receiving information about her son from people with more credentials than she would ever hold. "And you are?" "Felix Draper, hotel security, paramedic for 11 years, neurotoxicology unit." He did not decorate it. "My daughter was misdiagnosed for 14 months. I know what this looks like." Dr. Reginald Petch materialized at her right shoulder before she could answer, because men like Petch understood exactly when their presence was required. He had sat in on every family review session for Julian's case for 2 years. He had coordinated every third-party assessment. He had a way of arriving at difficult conversations that made him appear to be solving them rather than managing them. He was the medical director of Farwell Resources' Occupational Health Division, and he had held that position for 18 years, and he had been the first physician Constance called when Julian began declining. He looked at Felix's badge. He looked at the radio. He assembled the picture and his expression became professionally calm. Felix repeated what he had observed: the resting tremor, the asymmetry, the saccadic lag, the gait pattern. Precise language because it was the only tool available, and he intended to use it correctly. Petch listened without interrupting, which was not the response of a man dismissing what he heard. "Julian's symptom profile has been thoroughly reviewed by 11 specialists over 3 years," he said, including 2 neurologists at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. "What you're describing as a neurological finding is a documented side effect of his current medication class. His neurologist is aware of it and has judged it clinically acceptable." "Olanzapine and risperidone both produce bilateral tardive symptoms," Felix said. "Not asymmetric resting tremor isolated to the right side, not saccadic lag on the left. Tardive presentation is symmetric. This isn't." Petch's expression did not change. You've arrived at that conclusion from a 40-second observation in a hotel corridor. Yes. Chester Dunn appeared at Constance's left shoulder, where he always appeared at her events, because 11 years on the Farwell Resources Board had taught him that proximity to Constance during a moment of uncertainty was where influence was made and kept. He chaired the Environmental Compliance Subcommittee. He had managed that subcommittee with patience and precision for 9 years. Constance, Dunn said, there are 200 donors waiting and the photographer has been. Has anyone run a full environmental toxicology panel on Julian? Felix said directly to Constance over Dunn's sentence. Not the standard blood work. A complete speciation with whole blood manganese and arsenic and lead. Has that ever been ordered? Constance's eyes moved to Petch. Petch said there's no clinical indication for. He spent summers at a property 6 kilometers downstream from your company's Peace River tailings facility, Felix said. That's a clinical indication. The room behind them continued being the room it was. Someone laughed at the auction tables. A server passed with a tray. Constance stood in the space between the two men and said nothing for a count of several seconds. Dunn said that a hotel employee was not an appropriate source of medical guidance, and said it in the tone of a man closing a folder. Constance said, Felix, what happened to your daughter? So he told her. McPherson Road. 14 months of the wrong diagnosis. A young toxicologist at Sunnybrook, who ordered the test nobody had thought to run. Manganese in the water riser. The building owner's suppressed maintenance report. 18 months of collation and recovery. And Rosie drawing a straight line again at the end of it. He said it without decoration, the way he said most things, because decoration was not what the moment needed. Constance looked at him for a long time after he finished. If you're wrong, she said, you're telling me that 3 years of specialist consensus was dismissed by a security guard at my own foundation's gala on the strength of a personal story. You understand what that costs. I understand. Then say it again knowing that. Julian's symptom pattern is consistent with manganese toxicity and inconsistent with the diagnosis on file, Felix said, and the test that would settle it has never been ordered. Petch said that commissioning an environmental toxicology panel in connection with the Peace River property, even informally, created a liability position that Farwell's legal team would need to assess before. It's a blood draw, Constance said. It takes 1 vial in 24 hours. She turned to her assistant, Dr. Nadia Pellerin at the University of Alberta Hospital, toxicology. She was part of the independent site review 2 years ago. Get her on the phone tonight, not tomorrow. Dunn said the implications of a privately ordered tox panel linked to the Peace River property, even without formal documentation. Chester, she said, only his name. Dunn stopped. She turned back to Felix and held out her hand, and he gave her the hotel badge because it was faster than anything else. If the panel is negative, I'll ask the hotel to reassign you and I'll tell you why, she said. If it's positive, we'll discuss what comes next. Either way, I'm not waiting until Monday. She handed the badge back without looking at it and walked toward the stage, assembling the face 600 people had come to see. Petch watched her go. Then he turned and found Lena Strick near the coat check, and the conversation between them lasted 3.5 minutes. And Felix watched it from the corridor door and did not need to hear it to understand its shape. He finished his shift. He loaded the last of the stanchion equipment at midnight, signed out at the service desk, and drove north on Deerfoot Trail with the radio on low. Somewhere past the interchange, he understood that he had not made a decision back in that alcove, so much as failed to make the safe one, and that by morning the difference would probably not matter to anyone but him. He called Rosie from the parking garage the way he sometimes did on late shifts. She was asleep. He left no message. He sat in the car with the engine off and thought about a young man who had stopped painting. He had seen the portfolio on the foundation website before the gala. Julian had been good, had won a regional student award at 16, and had not picked up a brush in 3 years because the tremor in his right hand made a controlled stroke impossible. Dr. Nadia Pellerin ran the panel herself at the University Hospital the following morning. She had been engaged as an independent reviewer of the Peace River tailings site 2 years earlier, had submitted an assessment that identified potential liner failure in the secondary containment zone and had watched that assessment be quietly overruled through a subcommittee process she had not been invited to observe. She had continued to believe her numbers were correct. The opportunity to find out was not something she intended to process slowly. The whole blood manganese came back at 11.4 micrograms per liter. The normal ceiling was 1.8. She ordered arsenic and lead immediately. Both returned elevated. The arsenic profile suggested chronic low-grade exposure across several years. She pulled Julian's prior imaging, and in the 5th scan she found what she was looking for. A subtle signal change in the globus pallidus on the right side that had been present 18 months earlier, noted by the radiologist as a non-specific incidental finding, and never followed up. She turned the monitor toward Constance and let her read it without describing what it showed, which was, though no one said so, the first time in 3 years anyone had done that. Constance looked at the screen for a long time. She had built a company on the principle that numbers did not lie if you were willing to look at them directly, and she had never once applied that principle to her son's file. Because doing so would have required treating 11 physicians as a set of claims to be verified, rather than a wall to stand behind. She had outsourced the only thing she was genuinely good at. She understood that now, fully and without mitigation, and she said nothing about it to anyone in the room. Pellerin showed the results to Julian privately, without Petch or Strick present, in plain language. Julian had spent 3 years inside a diagnosis that had never quite matched what his own body kept insisting, and he had learned to distrust the gap between his experience and the file, because every credentialed person he saw told him the gap was the illness. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "So it wasn't in my head." Pellerin told him it was never in his head. She told him those two things, the phrase and the fact, were not the same at all. Lena Strick was asked to leave the family's employ the following week. What investigation later established was that her hiring had been arranged through a placement firm connected to Petch's occupational health consulting practice, and that across 2.5 years, she had accompanied Julian to 31 of his 47 medical appointments and had provided written symptom summaries to his attending physicians before they saw him. Summaries that consistently framed his presentation in terms that discouraged further neurological investigation. She had been paid for this in 2 separate streams, one of which appeared on no employment record. Reginald Petch did not resign. He waited to be removed, and the removal was complicated by the fact that he had never formally treated Julian, and had therefore never formally deceived anyone in a clinical capacity, a distinction he had maintained with considerable precision across 3 years. What could not be escaped was the environmental compliance file. The downstream monitoring protocol for the Peace River site used sampling points specified in writing by his department. The specification, it turned out, drew from locations upstream of the primary seepage zone. That detail was not in the annual filings. It was in the internal methodology notes, which existed because someone always writes the methodology notes, and someone always files them somewhere. Chester Dunn resigned from the board in December, citing the demands of his other commitments. The resignation preceded by 11 days the provincial environmental enforcement proceeding, and by 3 weeks the shareholder action filed in January. What Dunn had understood for 9 years, and had managed carefully across every quarterly meeting, was that a CEO with a seriously ill child was a CEO whose attention was distributed, and every quarter Constance had spent in waiting rooms, or in the particular grief of a problem no credential could solve, had been a quarter in which the compliance subcommittee operated without her full attention. The accounting firm she retained could not put a precise figure on what that had cost the company. The remediation figure was easier to calculate and considerably larger. Julian's treatment ran 16 weeks of chelation protocol under Pellerin's direction. Felix was not involved in the clinical work because he had no clinical standing and had not claimed any. What Pellerin told Constance 3 weeks into treatment was that the recovery literature on adult chronic heavy metal exposure said plainly that cognitive and motor rehabilitation was not a 45-minute twice-a-week task, and that if they treated it as one, they would get proportionally less than they were hoping for. Constance called Felix the following evening. He took unpaid leave from the hotel. The daily work was not dramatic. 6 hours, 5 days a week in a room with a whiteboard and a graduated series of fine motor exercises that Pellerin designed and Felix ran. Tremor tracking, grip precision exercises, visual coordination drills built from protocols Felix had first assembled for Rosie, and then refined over 18 months in a Sudbury apartment with a beadwork kit and a radio turned to the lowest setting he could find. Julian refused sessions on 11 days in the first month. Felix logged them as zeros and did not alter the record. On the third week, Julian threw a marker across the room, not in anger, in frustration, because his hand would not do what he was asking it, and Felix picked it up and set it back on the table and said nothing, because speaking was not what that moment needed. By April, Julian could hold a pen without the resting tremor breaking the stroke. By May, he could draw a horizontal line across a page and have it land where he intended. The Farwell Foundation's Governance Committee convened a review in September. A preliminary motion filed before Chester Dunn's resignation raised the question of whether a non-credentialed individual directing daily patient contact in a foundation-funded program constituted an unacceptable clinical exposure. Every fact in the motion was accurate. Felix sat where he was asked to sit, with a binder on the table in front of him, and no intention of disputing the record. When the chair asked him to respond, he did not try to argue credentials. He said, "The clinical program is Dr. Pellerin's. Every assessment, every protocol change, every signature is hers. What I run is the hours between her appointments, which were empty before I was in them. And empty not because no one cared, but because no reimbursement structure in this country funds 6 hours a day in a room with one patient. The standard of care is designed for standard presentations. This was not a standard presentation. The gap between what the standard covers and what was actually needed is not a clinical question. It is a scheduling problem that gets reclassified as a clinical impossibility because calling it impossible is cheaper than solving it." He opened the binder. 112 days of session logs, time-stamped, countersigned by Pellerin every second Friday. He did not explain them. He set them in front of the chair. Pellerin spoke for 8 minutes. She placed the baseline assessment beside the 4 subsequent ones and said, "At intake, Julian's whole blood manganese was 11.4 micrograms per liter, and his fine motor coordination score fell in the 2nd percentile for his age group. At 6 months, it was in the 41st. She said she would not publish that as a case study because the cohort was 1, and she was not in the business of claiming what she couldn't defend. She said the committee had not been asked to publish it. It had been asked whether it happened." Constance sat against the wall, recused from the vote, for the first 40 minutes without speaking. Her general counsel had prepared a 2-paragraph statement for her. She had read it once and left it on the table. When she spoke, she said, "3 years ago I gave my son's file to 11 people with credentials, and I never read it myself. I was given the summaries of his imaging results by the physician who had specified the imaging protocol. I was told what the numbers meant by a man who had a professional interest in what the numbers meant. I had a company to run and a board to manage and a gala every November, and it was easier to trust the wall than to look behind it. I am not asking this committee to excuse that. I am telling it to the record because it is the truth, and because the only thing I know how to do with the truth is say it in front of witnesses." Nobody at the table moved. "There was a contamination source," she said, "and there was a monitoring protocol designed to not find it. And there was a file built across 3 years to explain my son's symptoms as something they were not. 11 credentialed people reviewed that file and confirmed it. One man in a hotel blazer looked at my son for 40 seconds and understood it was wrong. I am not arguing to this committee that credentials don't matter. I am telling it that in this case, the credentials were the instrument used against us. The wall was the thing doing the damage." The chair called the vote. It ran 6-5 against suspension. The second motion established the program as a standing initiative under Pellerin's directorship, with Felix carrying the title of Rehabilitation Coordinator, a classification that had to be written into the foundation structure because it had not existed there before. Constance funded the first operational year from personal assets because the governance review had cost her the authority to direct foundation money, and she had decided before the vote was counted that she would pay for it either way. The following October, Farwell Resources entered a consent agreement with the provincial government covering remediation of the Peace River site and a 10-year downstream monitoring program funded at $18 million. The agreement did not constitute an admission of wrongdoing. Constance had spent enough time around legal language to understand what that phrase cost nothing to print. At the program's inaugural session, held in a refurbished clinical space at the university, Julian stood at a portable easel in front of roughly 60 people and demonstrated the fine motor protocol they had developed together. He was not explaining it, he was showing that it worked. He drew a long controlled arc across a sheet of paper, left to right, without the stroke breaking, and held the page up so the room could see it. Felix was standing at the back. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking. He had not planned to come. Pellerin had called the evening before to say Julian had asked, and that had been sufficient reason. He thought about Rosie, and about McPherson Road, and about 18 months of evenings with a bead lace and a beadwork kit and a radio turned low in a kitchen that had eventually stopped being an assault and become something she could sit inside. He had spent years afterward believing those 18 months were something that had happened to him, a period he had survived, a cost without a return. He understood now that they were not a cost. They were the only thing that had mattered in that hotel corridor, and nobody had ever been able to remove them from him, because no institution had put them there. Julian looked up from the easel and found Felix across the room. He did not wave or call out. He held the paper up a second time, deliberate so the arc was fully visible, and Felix raised his coffee cup 1 inch, and that was enough. A person does not need a credential to see clearly. Sometimes they only need to have looked at the same thing once before, in a different room, under different light, and to have refused, when everyone around them agreed it was time to move on, to walk past it.